with inequality and poverty. A constitutional review process is underway seeking to expropriate land without compensation. Not everyone agrees with this and thinks it's even necessary. So is it posturing in an election season, or can the process bring about meaningful change? Professor Ruth Hall is one of the foremost experts on the issue and joins us from our Cape Town studios. Good evening to you, and thank you for talking to us. As I said in my introduction, it's one of the most contentious issues in the public discourse at the moment, but how well informed is the discussion in general?
Well, I think we've had quite a polarized debate around this issue, with some people feeling that expropriation without compensation will solve all issues related to land, and others feeling that this is the beginning of the end of property rights in our society. Let's be clear, and I think that your insert earlier showed that there's some quite widespread misconceptions. The Constitution already provides for expropriation. That was part of our transition agreement in the 1990s, precisely because we cannot allow a situation where those who own private property now are able to prevent any form of redistribution or restitution. So our property dispensation already says there must be redistribution and restitution, and where needed, the state can expropriate, and it need not pay market price. So these powers have existed for 22 years, since the Constitution was adopted in 1996, up to now. The state has chosen not to use its powers to expropriate. And what we're seeing now is a situation where the state is going to start to use those powers, and also to see what are the limits of the existing constitutional framework. In other words, where the Constitution requires that compensation to be paid to those expropriated be just and equitable, under what circumstances could it be just and equitable to pay no compensation? So that's where I think the debate is right now.
I mean, let's just talk through what you've just outlined here. Yourself, of course, is an expert on this, and you might have seen in our package, Albie Sachs, Tembekele Ngqoba-Ngqaitopi, a number of experts on this issue all say that Section 25 does not need to be reviewed, that there's enough provisions in the Constitution as it currently stands to deal with this issue. So we have to ask the question, what has failed in terms of land reform and the restitution process that has brought us to this moment?
Well, I think that we've seen a political failure, and I think that the ANC at its conference in December actually acknowledged that as a ruling party over many years, it's actually failed to confront the land issue, and that it could have done so within the parameters of the Constitution. This is a point reiterated by the Parliamentary High-Level Panel, chaired by former President Kgalema Motlanthe, which reported last year and said the failings of land reform have not been due to constitutional constraints, but rather there's been a lack of clear policy direction. There's been weak political leadership. There have been inadequate budgets, weak institutions, mismanagement and corruption. So those are the issues. What we heard last week in Parliament was the new minister, Maite Mashabane, saying that even while the Constitutional Review Committee process is underway to look into whether, and if so, how to amend the Constitution, government will go ahead and start to expropriate properties, paying just and equitable compensation as required. In other words, working within the confines of the Constitution as it stands. So I think that we might start to see some test cases going to the courts where the state expropriates, it will be contested. Rather than speeding up the process, we think that initially it might actually slow the process down, because every case is going to be contested. So let's be clear, expropriation is a standard, law-bound process that states across the world embark upon, and indeed our state already expropriates for public purposes. The difference is now that the state is looking to expropriate for land reform purposes, which of course is necessary, where you have a land claim on a particular property in order to address the historical injustice. The Constitution mandates the state, in fact requires it, to take action. So I think that we're into a new era. The ANC is working out its policy. The Constitutional Review Committee process is going to be highly contested. Already the committee has received more than 140,000 submissions, so it's been swamped. And of course, this is a lightning rod issue for the Ramaphosa administration, where I think that he's been handed this massive mandate. He has to see it through. I think that what we're probably going to see is a discussion about which types of properties should be compensated fully or partially or not at all. And if you look at the ANC resolution, it already says we should target state-owned land for expropriation, but also privately owned land that is vacant, unused, hopelessly indebted, or purely held for speculative purposes. So I think the hysteria about the whole of the commercial farmland being in one fell swoop expropriated is simply inaccurate. People need to read Section 25, the property clause in the Constitution, and also the ANC resolution to get a clearer sense of where we're at.
So there's no conversation that needs to be had about even balancing the need for land reform and fears about property rights, for example.
Well, you know, I think that we had those debates in the 1990s when the ANC said property is already governed in the common law. We don't need a property clause in the Constitution. But we ended up having one as a compromise. But that deal that was struck said there are property rights for those who own private property. But those who were dispossessed also have rights. And in fact, our vision as a society towards justice and overcoming the injustice of the past, of land dispossession, and the poverty that it produced and is being reproduced across generations, requires us to confront private property, and we will do so within a reasonable process, within the rule of law, and subject to the review by the courts. So I think that we're still within that situation where whatever is agreed upon will be subject to judicial review. Let me also mention that a third important process, alongside the ANC policy process and the constitutional review process, is that the expropriation bill is in Parliament. And it may well be that that bill could be amended to provide some clear direction as to the circumstances under which the state will compensate to a limited degree, or not compensate at all. So I think that that is also another way in which we can advance this discussion. But let's be clear that the state was never forced to embark on a willing buyer, willing seller approach to land reform. That was a policy choice. And in fact, the term willing buyer, willing seller appears nowhere within the Constitution. So I think that what we're now seeing is the ANC starting to say, we're going to start to use our unused constitutional powers, and let's see if the Constitution is a constraint or not. I think there are those within the ANC who think that the Constitution should be amended, but I think that that's by no means an area of consensus.
Prof, one of the issues that's constantly brought up around this discussion is capital flight. This is going to scare investors. You've spoken at length on other platforms about how, for example, the Asian tigers were, their performance economically was underpinned by agrarian reform. You say similar moves were made in the United States, for example, under different circumstances, but that is going to have to be the way we must proceed if we are to deal with poverty and inequality.
Well, I think that moving towards more broad-based access to land, a greater variety of large, medium and small-scale farms, well-located land for the poor in the towns and in the cities as well as in the countryside is absolutely essential. We've seen very clearly over the last few months that many of those who are calling for a rapid land reform are actually saying we want well-located land in the cities, not only farms. So I think that what we can see is that there is demand across the board. I think that a lot of financial institutions and investors are more concerned about policy certainty and are actually okay with expropriation, which already exists. Even commercial farming organizations such as Agri-SA do not oppose expropriation of land. They understand that it's necessary. So I think that what we're in a period of uncertainty where I think a lot of people are waiting for the ruling party to declare itself on how it will approach this. And I think that there are two issues around investors and financial institutions. The one is, what is their debt exposure? We know that our big four banks plus the land bank are sitting on about 160 billion rand of farmland debt. So they are concerned about, what would happen if substantial numbers of those farms were expropriated without compensation. What happens to the bottom line? But I think that a much more significant concern across the board is if there were to be a very dramatic increase in expropriation without compensation. For instance, the EFF vision is not that it will be done on a one-by-one basis basis subject to review by the courts, but rather as a blanket approach, nationalization of land, state custodianship of land. I think that's where a lot of investment concern arises. So I think that, you know, the ball is very much in the ruling party's court to come up with clear positions, convey those to the Constitutional Review Committee, and over time to create a degree of certainty about how these powers that already exist within the Constitution can and should be used.
Professor Hall, thank you for talking to us this evening. Facts matter. It's important that in this debate we don't get lost in the hysteria, but we stick to the information. And of course, policy certainty is going to go a long way in providing that clarity. That's it for this section of the bulletin. We'll be back in just a moment with Prime Biz and more of the day's news. Stay with us.